Today, we're going to have a look at a fairly crap graphics card, and we're going to compare it to the OG fairly crap graphics card, the GT 710. And I'm going to show you a couple of ways in which I think the GT 1030 is actually worse than the GT 710. Now I already hear you say, Dawid, you should probably lay off the strong cheese at night, because in what world can the GT 1030 be worse than the GT 710? Now before we get into any of that, let's just see why I'm even comparing these two graphics cards. Now in my opinion, the GT 1030 is the closest thing in the current Nvidia lineup to like a spiritual successor of the GT 710. And as the fairly hilarious comment section on my first GT 710 video pointed out, the GT series of graphics cards from Nvidia aren't really designed for gamers. They're basically just a way to add video outputs to a PC. But if all you need is video out for a PC, should you spend twice as much money going to a GT 1030 over a GT 710? Now if you put a GT 1030 down next to a GT 710, you'll see that physically they're very similar and they'll both fit in the same wide range of cases. The specific version of the GT 1030 that I'm using is a GDDR5 version of the card with a fan, although there are passive versions of the cards available. When looking at the GPU specifications, the GT 1030 is a pretty big step up from the GT 710. Now the more eagle-eyed of you would have noticed that the GT 710 that I'm using today is the salmonella version of the graphics card. So it is the worst version of the GT 710. The thing is though, I may have slightly broken the better GT 710 that I have. So on paper, it should be a much more powerful graphics card. So with that, let's have a look at some gaming benchmarks just to see how much faster the GT 1030 is. In regards to the system that I used to test these two graphics cards, it's got an Intel i7-9700K in it, overclocked to 5 GHz, just to make sure we don't have a CPU bottleneck on these graphics cards, and then it's got 16 gigs of DOM plats at 3000 MHz. And as you can clearly tell, when it comes to gaming, the GT 1030 is significantly more powerful than the GT 710. In fact, in most of the tests, it's about 4 times as fast. And honestly, most of these games are playable at 1080p at the lowest settings, especially the esports titles. Although I would say it's not ideal gaming performance by any measure. Now, just out of interest, I also compared it to the integrated graphics on the i7-9700K. And as you can see, it forms a nice grayscale in performance, going from completely unplayable on the GT 710 to just about playable on the lowest settings in newer games on the GT 1030. So when comparing the gaming performance of the GT 1030 to the GT 710, the GT 1030 isn't looking too bad. You're spending about twice as much money, but you're getting 4 times the performance. Seems like a real deal to me. The thing is though, if you take into account the fact that this GT 1030 costs about $85, it doesn't look that great, because for $100, which is only $15 more, you can get an AMD RX 560, which is a significantly better performing graphics card. And again, as we established from the comment section of my first GT 710 video, the gaming performance is kind of irrelevant on these graphics cards, because that's not what anyone uses it for. Now is a good time to answer why I think the GT 1030 is actually worse in a lot of situations than the GT 710. And it comes down to the main use case for this graphics card. If you look at the rear I/O of every single GT 1030 that exists, it's only got 2 video outputs. It's got an HDMI port and a DVI port, so it loses the VGA port of the GT 710. Losing a VGA port doesn't seem like that big a deal because it's not, well, 2004. But it does make a big difference because it means that you lose the ability to add a third monitor, which is fairly important for productivity use cases. And that's why I think the GT1030 is actually a worse display adapter than the GT710. So when looking at the GT1030 as just a display adapter, which I would argue is what it is, it's looking pretty terrible compared to the GT710. However, there is one display adapter use case that makes this worthwhile over the GT710, and that's if you have a 4K display. Because the HDMI on the GT710 only supports 4K at 30 Hz, and please, nobody ever use a monitor at 30 Hz, that's just the worst thing you can do. And this HDMI on the 1030 supports 60 Hz 4K. So if you have a single 4K display for your emails and Word and Facebook, which you probably shouldn't be doing, but if that's the case, buy a 1030. If you have any other monitor configuration for non-gaming applications, buy the GT710 instead, and you're going to be saving a decent chunk of change. That's a very niche use case though. It's almost like a knife that can only cut cheese, which I've been told is a thing that people buy. Anyway, I don't know why I'm talking so much about cheese today. But after some fairly extensive consideration, I think we may have thought of another use case. I was having a quick chat with a member of the Dawid Does Tech Stuff Discord, who said that these GT1030s work quite well to convert low-profile Dell Optiplex PCs into like esports title gaming machines. Now my first thought was, well, why don't you just buy a GTX 1650? Because you get low-profile versions of those and you get a lot more performance. The problem with that though is that it costs more than double what this graphics card costs. And for some people, a budget really is a budget. So if you have less than $100 to spend on a graphics card, and you have a low profile Dell Optiplex PC, and you don't want to buy secondhand graphics cards, then I guess you found your graphics card. There are so many caveats to the use case for this graphics card that it's actually pretty crazy, but I guess we finally found one. Yeah, so with that bombshell, I think we can end off this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one. Follow me on whatever social media you're interested. I'll have them all linked in the description below. And until the next video, bye-bye.